So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the NITheCS Colloquium. My name is Francesco Petruccione, and I'm the so-called interim director of NITheCS. Yeah? This afternoon, we are very honored to have Professor George Ellis with us. George is based at UCT, where he's Professor Emeritus in Applied Mathematics, and he has been there for quite a few moons. Yeah, but many more moons ago, he did his PhD in Cambridge in cosmology and related fields, and where he also had the opportunity to write a very famous book with Stephen Hawking about the large-scale structure of the universe. Yeah? In more recent years, he devoted lots of time and interest to more philosophical aspects of cosmology and surroundings, and he got very interested in questions of complexity, yeah, in maybe classical and quantum settings, yeah, if I may say so. Yeah, and the topic of this afternoon that you can see on the board, yeah, is in this area of research. Yeah. So, George, we are very, very happy that you are here and very keen to listen to what you have to tell us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And so the topic is quantum physics and biology, the local wave function approach. It's quite controversial, but I believe in it quite strongly. So there's a puzzle of quantum physics in relation to complexity I want to talk about. It raises the issue, the emergence of complexity, what is its basis? And this leads on to molecular biology based on molecular shape issues in quantum chemistry. And the local wave function approach is the key. And there's a paper on this already, Quantum Physics and Biology, the local wave function approach. In the Journal of Physics conference series is shown there. And actually tomorrow morning on the archive, a new paper will come out taking it a little further. Okay, the puzzle is this. Quantum physics is a linear theory, but the real world is not linear. If you look at the picture of the zebra and the grass, there's not a single straight line in that picture. Okay, and furthermore, he will start moving, and he will not move in a linear manner. He will accelerate, he will stop, he will jump. There's nothing linear about the real world. So how is it compatible that the real world is based in a theory which is at its core linear? Now, nowadays, it is often claimed there's a unitary evolving wave function of the entire universe from which all else follows, the so-called wave function of the universe. And the proposal then is that all that happens is based in the linearity of a single wave function. There's a problem somewhere. Even if the wave function lives in a very high dimensional space, not infinite, don't confuse very large with infinity, there's some basic incompatibility, and that's what I'm interested in. So the hierarchy in biology, you have on the top left the physics space, the atom, then you have molecules, cells, first level where life occurs, tissues, organs, body systems, organisms, the basic emergent entity life, populations, communities, and ecosystems, and those are the context for the organisms, and nothing here is remotely linear. Now, what about the essential linearity of quantum theory? And I started this in 2012, a paper on the limits of quantum theory, contextuality, and the quantum classical cut. And the Schrödinger-Dirac equation is written out there, I h bar d bar dt of psi is h hat psi. It's linear. Now it's linear because there is no other term on the right. There's no source term on the right. H does not involve psi, it's not nonlinear in that sense. And so it's linear in psi t. This results in Hamiltonian evolution. It results in superposition and entanglement, and I don't know how it got lost, but the crucial point is it results in Hilbert spaces. The reason that Hilbert spaces are usable in quantum mechanics is because this is a linear equation, and the linear structure of Hilbert space is there to reflect this structure. also Fermi-Dirac statistics and Bose-Einstein statistics, they're also linear, if you think about it. So all of this is linear. Now, I want to talk about essential and inessential nonlinearities. Now, the Hamiltonian is nonlinear, and that results in Feynman diagrams as a calculation tool, but the wave function is still propagated linearly. The fact that h hat is nonlinear doesn't affect the fact that on the right there is a single psi, and it acts on the left, there's a single psi on the right, so the equation is linear. The essential nonlinearity one is wave function collapse to an eigenstate when you have a general superposition and you end up in an eigenstate of some operator. Now, I believe that this happens by what I call contextual wave function collapse. And I wrote a paper with my friend Barbara Drossel about this when I was in Durban with Francesco quite a number of years ago. And I think this is a very useful equation. And if any of you are physicists who want to talk about a many worlds or many minds theory where collapse never happens, this is not the way to go. This is a very desperate attempt to claim that only linear dynamics occurs, but that simply isn't the case. Then there's a whole lot of stuff about hidden variables, pilot waves, and so on. And I like to use the economist terms. Those theories have no cash value because they don't make any difference to the fact that we cannot predict the outcome of quantum physics from knowing the initial state of the wave function. And this is the absolutely fundamental thing that the quantum physics predicts probabilities of outcomes. It doesn't predict a single actual outcome. Now, okay, so now the essential second one is the square in the Born's rule. So there you get the probabilities not from the wave function itself, but the square. And so the wave function does not directly give probabilities, but gives the square. And that's where the imaginary numbers, it's why imaginary functions are crucial in quantum physics, is because they're square. And that's a very important nonlinearity. But the wave function still propagates linear, and when you get the result, it's nonlinear, but in a very direct kind of way, you simply take the square. Okay, now, there are real-world quantum linearities which are very, very impressive. Superposition has been demonstrated at macro scales, and entanglement has been demonstrated at macro scales. In fact, that's what the Nobel Prize was given for a couple of years ago. But in order to get those long-range macro scale entanglement like Anton Zeilinger did over a couple of 100 kilometers, you have to work very, very hard to prevent nonlinear effects from interfering. So you need very, very precise engineering context. You need very, very smooth surfaces, machined at high cost. You need interactions with heat paths minimized. So you have to have very, very low temperatures, which is actually extremely costly. You have to buy liquid helium, and you have decoherence effects must be fought by isolation. And it's because of all of this that quantum computing is so difficult. You have to prevent these nonlinearities from getting rid of the entanglements, which are the core of quantum computing. So that you can get, in some very particular cases, linearities of quantum physics on large scales, but none of this relates to biology, or for that matter, digital computers. If you think about digital computers, they're immensely complex, non-linear things. There's no way that you can describe a digital computer by a linear action. Now, what are some of the real-world nonlinearities I'm concerned with? One is networks. Biology is full of networks, gene-regulatory networks, metabolic networks in the brain. Totally nonlinear effects are taking place in those cases. The next one, which I will talk a bit more about, is feedback control loops, or homeostasis. And homeostasis is what keeps us all healthy and alive. There are thousands of feedback control loops in biology in every living cell. It's the basis of much engineering, like aircraft autopilots, chemical plants. And in daily life, thermostats are an example of feedback control. I'm going to come back to it in just a minute. The point about this is that when you have a feedback control loop, the initial data is irrelevant. The outcome is determined by the goal. With the thermostat, you set the temperature. And the whole point of a thermostat is to make the initial data irrelevant. And so if you double the initial amplitude of some variable, the outcome is unchanged. So that is obviously a non-linear. So this cannot be described by evolution of a single wave function, because that doesn't show the kind of behavior which you get back in homeostasis. And furthermore, it functions by branching dynamics, and unitary stuff can't branch. So here you have a control loop enabled by structure of a cybernetic system. So you've got a system state. For instance, the temperature in the room, you've got your goal, the temperature you would like to be. You've got a comparator which measures the temperature, and then you've got your state set, and then you get an error message, which is an information flow which goes to the controller, and that either turns the heater on or the cooler on, and you go round and round that loop until you've got the temperature that you want. So information flows through specifically constructed feedback loops, and a thermostat is the classic example. And the goal is the chosen temperature. And the logic is, if the temperature is less, then apply heat, else do not apply heat. And this is branching dynamics. Branching dynamics is the core of what happens in almost all emergent systems. You can't get that out of the Schrödinger equation. It's not linear, rather branching dynamics. Now, the meta issue which one needs to stand back and ask is, each theory has a domain of application. Newtonian physics is very good within its domain of application. So is Galilean gravity. So is Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism, but they each apply in a particular domain. Within that domain, they're incredibly good, but there is a limit. What people don't seem to ask nowadays is, setting aside the issue of quantum gravity where it is asked, what's the domain of application of quantum theory? And when I was a young student, people assumed quantum mechanics applied on the terribly small scale and not that it applied on the big scale. Nowadays, people talk about quantum mechanics applying to brains, and the whole universe is one go. But the domain of quantum theory is limited. And for example, feedback control, I'll come back to that in a minute. And my friend Barbara Drossel has written what I regard as a very important paper, 10 reasons why a thermalized system cannot be described by a many-particle wave function. And the point about it is, a thermal system is an immense amount of random stuff going on. And if you try to describe that linearly, you're simply going to fail. And that is why you can't describe it by a many-particle wave function. And I strongly recommend that paper as something to look at. Now, the way out of this dilemma is to go back to general relativity, where I worked for a long time. And what happened in general relativity was the idea of an atlas of coordinates. Now there you see a coordinate x1, and it is valid within a particular domain, a coordinate system x2, valid in another domain, x3, x4. Each of these coordinate systems is valid in a restricted domain, but together they cover the entire manifold. And that was the big discovery in general relativity. Local coordinates cover part of a manifold. They're joined by overlap domains. The atlas is all of them. It covers the manifold globally, but often there's no single coordinate system exists for the whole space. And a very simple example is a two-sphere. The surface of the Earth can't be covered by a single coordinate system because there's a coordinate singularity at the North Pole and the South Pole. And the coordinates break down at those two places. And so this is an example. Now, the uses of atlases made global studies in general relativity possible. It underlies all of the progress we made understanding black holes, and the various coordinate systems used to study them was by this idea of an atlas of coordinates. Coordinate x1 holds within the one domain, x2, x3. At the interlapse domains, there are functions connecting them, and that is how you describe the space-time in general relativity. So my idea for quantum mechanics is local wave functions in exactly the same way. Essentially the same applies to quantum theory. So my idea is that wave functions, local wave functions exist everywhere, but in the real universe, no global wave function exists. So there's not a single wave function for most macroscopic objects, such as a cat. So the summary, quantum of physics applies locally everywhere. Of course, quantum of physics applies everywhere. But the question is, in how big a domain is it applies? I'm translating that to say, how big is the domain within which a specific wave function applies, and they are each limited. So how are they limited, in what way? And people have tried to talk about the limits of quantum theory. They've sometimes tried to say there's a certain length scale. They've sometimes tried to say there's a certain energy scale, but that's not the issue. The issue is, within the domain, given the context, is the dynamics linear or not? And you can make it very large, as Anton Zeilinger shows, but you have to work very, very hard. You have to spend a lot of money to make it a big domain. In most cases, it's a very, very small domain. So local wave functions, psi1, psi2, psi3, psi4, the dynamics is linear in each domain because you choose the domains so that will be the case. Combine these systems, these cover the system globally, but there's no single wave function for the whole. And nonlinearity is possible by combining linear dynamics of local wave functions, a patchwork of local wave functions. And in those intersections, you relate them. And what you have there is a transformation between the wave function, and you have a transformation between the Hilbert spaces, which is a Bogoliubov transformation. So here you have the feedback control. You have one local wave function there, one local wave function there, one local wave function there. Each of those is chosen so that the dynamics is linear, but between them, if you take those three wave functions together, you now have a way of describing a feedback control system with three separate linear things. Local wave functions, what this means is macro objects are classical. There's no single wave function for a cat as a whole. So you probably, if you looked at read about Schrödinger's cat, people talk about wave function psi cat, and you see a equation. Psi cat is A psi alive plus P psi z. None of those wave functions exist. It's a completely illegitimate equation. So this simply doesn't exist. If you look at that picture, you've got a radioactive substance, a Geiger counter, a relay, a hammer, a flask, a cat, and a container. The only quantum feature in this thing is a set of excited atoms. Everything else in this diagram is classical. And so that's the crucial thing which people just don't talk about. They don't think, where is the quantum uncertainty? Where the quantum uncertainty exists is when that radioactive substance is going to decay. Every other thing in that diagram has got classical behavior. It can be described classically. And this is how this goes. It means there's no single wave function for the universe as a whole, as many people claim, because cats exist in the universe. And that, therefore, is too bad for the Everett multiverse. If any of you believe in the Everett multiverse, this is a claim that there cannot possibly be such a thing as the Everett multiverse. So it means macro objects are classical, and the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics is, in fact, in my view, valid. Apparatus is classical. It cannot be described in a single wave function because its dynamics are not linear. If you take any quantum physics experimental paper, and this is a famous a diagram from a paper by Alain Aspect for the Bell test. If you look at that picture, there is a wave function equation up there. Everything in that diagram is classical except the little atoms, the particles going to the left in red and the ones going to the right in blue. Those are the only quantum things in there. Everything else, the coincident detector, the source, the beam splitter, the detectors, every one of those is classical. So on this view, there is a very good justification for the Copenhagen interpretation. There is no need to try to get a wave function for the apparatus as a whole. And if you did, you couldn't do quantum mechanics because the apparatus wouldn't be in a specific space, and you couldn't even start to calculate what the result of the calculation would be, because you'd be going round and round in circles with everything indefinite. So all is classical. The beam splitters, detectors, coincident detectors, except a few interacting particles. So that's about quantum physics. But okay, given these local wave functions, how do you build up a complex system like an animal? Complex systems, digital computers, aircraft cities are all modular hierarchical structures. They're made up of modules. They're hierarchical. The modules gather together to make a whole, and there are structures, which is important. They're associated with functional purpose, whereas there's no purpose in physics. So all of that quantum stuff we were looking at, there wasn't any purpose in it. It just is what it is. It obeys the Dirac equations. There's nothing purposeful about it. But once you stick the physical bases together in modular hierarchical structures, you can construct systems with purpose, with function and purpose. And there's a very nice article about this by Nobel Prize winner Leland Hartwell and others, from molecular to modular cell biology. And this is talking about how at the physics level there's no purpose, but at the biological level there is. How does this arrive? And the core link between the physics and the biology is properties of macromolecules. And Jean-Marie Laine was the person who basically pioneered the subject of supramolecular chemistry, and his paper is called From Molecular Information Towards Self-Organization and Complex Matter, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. The point is that proteins are made up, they're very, very complex molecules made up of hundreds of atoms, and they change shape, and it's that change of shape which is the key activator in molecular biology. So it's change of conformation, which is change of shape, underlies all function of biology at higher levels. And this was the revolution of molecular biology last century. So you've got the hierarchy: particles, atoms, chemistry, biochemistry, cell biology, neurology, botany, zoology, physiology, psychology, sociology, economics, and politics. And there's different descriptions, different variables, and different effective laws at each emergent level. But there are well-defined laws at the level of particles, atoms, chemistry, biochemistry, cell biology, and neurology, botany, zoology, physiology. Psychology, it gets a bit dodgy. Sociology, economics, and politics, it gets very dodgy. Nevertheless, they are very clearly separate levels of emergence in which different kinds of things happen at the different levels. Now, the way this works is not only does influences go upwards, but influences go downwards. Same level causation happens at every level. So if you look at that, at each level, same level causation is taking place. Whether we understand it or not, the laws of economics are determining prices, they're determining how much gets sold and all of that kind of thing. Now, those levels are linked by upward emergence due to coarse graining and symmetry breaking or black boxing, and they're linked by downward effects due to two key things. They're due to time-dependent constraints, and they're due to the ability of higher levels to create, modify, or delete lower-level elements. These are the two ways downward causation works: constraints, which change with time, and the fact that a higher level can change lower levels. And in quantum physics, this is the function of quantum field theory, where there are creation and annihilation operators, and those change the elements at the lower level. And so you don't have the case of the billiard balls bouncing against each other's unchanging by the context. The very lower levels are indeed changed by the context in which things happen. And these together enable the same level effective laws to emerge. And each level that I was looking at there, at each level they show contextually based logical branching. If Tx, then F1, else F2, where y is a dynamical variable and x is a control variable at the same level or higher level. And this, of course, is not something that you can describe by the Schrödinger equation as such, because the Schrödinger equation simply doesn't have behavior which is like that. So in biology, I want to talk about constraints first. I've talked about homeostasis briefly. Oscillators is a case of feedback control, the heart or the lung. Whenever there's an oscillator, there's some kind of feedback control taking place. And neural networks, the nervous system and learning, where signals go around, they change the strength of neural network connections, and then it goes round and round. Those are it is the connections of the neural network send signals around particular paths, and it's the pattern of the paths that the signals go on, which is shaped by the connections, which determines how we think. Now, the very interesting example I'm going to do is ion channels and axons in the brain, which enables action potential spike chains to propagate in neurons. That's the first one I'm going to do, and the second one will be creating, changing, deleting lower level elements, which is where gene regulatory networks and metabolic networks come in, developmental processes, determining cell types, and natural selection, adaptation to the environment. So downward causation takes place by constraints and by changing lower level elements. Let's go to the constraints. Here's the thermostat. On the left, there's a higher level structure. There's a particularly, you've got a bimetallic spring, you've got a magnet, a low switch, and so on. On the right is the outside view where you control it. The digital settings, you set the digital setting there, that determines how fast molecules move in the room. So you've got a macro level structure, you change that and it determines the motion, the average speed of motion of molecules. So that's downward causation. If you break the loop, if you had that feedback control loop, just to have all of the elements there but decouple a wire, it won't work even though all parts of there, you've changed the circuit topology from a closed topology to an open one, and it will no longer function as a thermostat. The system is the emergent structure from the parts is connected so as to give the outcome. The system constrains the flows of electrons in the wires. The whole is more than the sum of parts. It has organization between the parts. And an interesting one, if you've got all the same part and you simply swap the terminals, so the sign of the error signal has changed, the outcome will be different. You will burn out your heater. Now, a very interesting one in biology is ion channels, which are proteins which control ion flows across a cell wall. And here is a cell wall in your brain. And at the top you have sodium outside, and below is the inside of the cell. And on the left, the wall is closed. The voltage gradient is upward. If you see, there's a minus below and a plus above, and that has resulted in the protein closing, and the sodium can't get in. Now, on the right, the voltage, so the gate is closed. On the right, the voltage gradient is downward. The pluses are at the bottom, and the minuses are at the top, so that it's the other way around, and it opens, and the sodium can get in. And this is an example of constraints. On the left, there is a constraint preventing the ions getting in. On the right is now the constraint has changed and the ion can get in. Why is it changed? Because the voltage across the cell wall has changed. So on the left, the gate's closed. On the right, it's open. And this is an example of a change of shape which allows currents to flow or not flow. It's a constraint which has changed with time. It enables logic to emerge from the underlying physics by the change, conformation shape, change of shape. And this is the magic thing. Logic is coming out of the underlying physics. If upward, then channel closed. If downward, then channel open. And that chains up to enable logical branching at higher emergent levels in the brain, because this is happening in every single neuron in the brain. And those are put into immensely complex neural networks. This underlies the way we think. Let's take a slightly closer look at the molecular structure. This is the structure of that protein. And this is a side view when it's closed. And at the top, there are four, you only see two of them, four kind of great big paddles which can move open and closed. And in this case, they are closed. And here is a top view of exactly the same structure. And you see the four paddles now going round and round. And you see in the middle a little yellow, red thing, which is the ion going through. And so this is the structure. And so I'm trying to confirm this thing. Molecular biologies change in the shape of proteins. And change of shape is how logic emerges out of these molecules. And this is a key example, and this is what enables you to think. So on the left side view closed, on the right top view when it's open. The key is the changing conformational shape of the protein ion channels responding to electric voltage across the cell wall. And it's a top-down thing because the scale of the of the protein is much, much bigger than the scale of the ion. So it's top down from the scale of the protein down to the scale of the ion. Downward control of ion flows arising by change of shape or form. Such molecules came into existence via evolutionary selection. Some of you may remember Andreas Wagner visited here a year or so ago. How did this incredibly complicated thing come into existence? Well, evolution basically worked out that if you had these molecules, then we would be able to think. Okay. Now, I'm going to turn to the way that higher levels can change lower level elements. So this is a polar bear. It's white because if it was dark, it couldn't creep up on its prey. If it's white, it can creep up on them. So the environment basically says to the bear, it's a good idea to be white, not black. You don't want to be like your cousins over in Canada who are black or brown. That leads to a DNA sequence which will lead to the animal being white. That leads to the proteins, namely the proteins in the fur which make the fur white. So the adaptation leads to genes via gene regulating networks, which leads to the white. And the selection principle is survival and reproduction. It creates lower level elements, namely the proteins, which lead to the fur being white. Different environment. If you had the Canadian forest, you would have different genes, different DNA, because the DNA would be different, and you would get black fur. So altered genes change stereotroph proteins at the molecular level. This is an example of downward causation, which changes the lower level elements. Now, of course, underneath all of this, quantum chemistry is taking place, which I will say something about in a minute, but I'm trying to just get a bit of a picture of how complexity emerges out of the linear underlying stuff which is taking place. This is clearly multi-level. Each level is selected to enable ecological adaptation. The animal is selected, the DNA sequence is selected, the proteins are selected, all levels are simultaneously selected. So here's a DNA double sequence in a physical form at the bottom, in a schematic form on the top. You have the double helix, you have CAGT, you have your double helix background, the double strands, complementary base pairs, adenine A, which pairs with thymine T, guanine G, pairs with cytosine C. So the two sequences of base pairs are complementary on the two strands. The ecological context, as I've just explained, determines the sequence along there, CAGG. That was determined by the geological context, by the coding logic. These triplets cause amino acids. They fold to give you the proteins, and the sequence of complementary base pairs in the DNA double helix, shaped by evolutionary history, determines proteins via the sequence of amino acids. And so this is top-down causation. A higher level, in this case, the fact that the Arctic is white is chaining down, right down to the level of these proteins, and of course, down to the level of the atoms, the protons and electrons which make them. Now, what's the role of quantum physics in what I've just been talking about? Firstly, quantum physics leads to the nature of the chemical elements via the Pauli exclusion principle, which leads to the electron shells, which lead to the nature, carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and so on. Secondly, quantum physics leads to definite outcomes, contextual wave function collapse. And so in all of these interactions that I've just been talking about the folding and all of that, at the base, there are quantum interactions taking place. They produce classical outcomes, and that takes place by contextual wave function collapse. And in that paper, we give a detailed analysis of a particular case of a quantum classical transition. Namely, we analyze the functioning of a photodiode and the way that all the stages of the process, from higher to lower scales in the photodiode, take place in the context of classical entities that provides the context for what place. If you analyze how actually in the real world the photo detection takes place in a photodiode, you will find in accordance with what I've been said, basically it's a Copenhagen situation. Many of the stages there are classical, and now the same will be true in the case of plants. Plants, they get photons in, they relieve electrons, and eventually that releases energy. And again, that's an analogous process to what's going on here. Now, the core of this is quantum chemistry. And as I mentioned, Jean-Marie Lehn, macromolecular shape, a classical variable. And it's very important. If you ask yourself, how does quantum physics describe shape? It's actually quite a complicated question, and one which various people have written about. I've written about that with a colleague of mine. Walter Cohn produced density functional theory. Each of these people got the Nobel Prize, and that took a certain stage. But the person who, in my mind, is the quantum chemist par excellence is Martin Karplus, who got the Nobel Prize for his multiscale models. And the point about it is these other guys were looking at how quantum chemistry works in principle. Karplus put it in a biological context. And in all of these cases, everything's nonlinear. There's no possibility of describing anything I've been described by a single wave function. There are local wave functions everywhere. So in the Karplus Nobel lecture, he talks about the laws of motions for the atoms. He says, although the laws governing the motions of atoms are quantum mechanical, the essential realization that made possible the treatment of the dynamics of complex systems was that a classical mechanical description of atom motions is adequate in most cases. This realization was derived from simulation of the H plus H2 exchange reaction. There was a sense, even at the time, of something truly historic going on, of getting these first glimpses of how an enzyme molecule, for example, might undergo internal motions that allow it to function as a biological catalyst. He went on to develop methods to study complex chemical systems, including biomolecules. We have to consider the two elements that govern their behavior: the potential surface on which the atoms move, and the laws of motion that determines dynamics of the atoms on the potential surfaces. Thus, one does not actually solve the Schrödinger equation. A classical background provides a basis for determining the quantum states, as is generally true when wave function collapse determines outcomes. The last is my add-on. But the point is, Karplus is saying, if you're truly trying to do quantum chemistry in a real-world context relating to biology, you follow exactly what I've been saying. The Copenhagen interpretation is what you need. You cannot even in principle solve by itself the Schrödinger equation, and the thing works like I've been saying it works. How does this relate to biological function? Karplus states, first, evolution determines a protein structure, which in many cases, though not all, is made up of relatively rigid units that are connected by hinges. This is what I was showing you in the case of that protein. They allow the units to move with respect to one another. Second, there's a signal, usually the binding of a ligand, that changes the equilibrium between the structures with the rigid units in different positions, so there's a change of position. This type of conformational change occurs in many enzymes as an essential part of their mechanism. And so you don't solve the Schrödinger equation. A classical background provides a basis for the quantum states. And one could not sensibly solve it with a single wave function, for there is no reason to suppose a single wave function exists even for a single one of these molecules. And I think Martin Karplus is terrific. And if I was running this organization, I would ask him to come and visit and talk about quantum chemistry. Very interesting question. What about creation and annihilation of entities? Well, what's the link to quantum theory? It has to be via creation and annihilation of quantum field theory. And I have found very little written about this. Maybe you guys know more about it. When do creation and annihilation operators operate in quantum field theory? And I've searched the books for statement. They talk all about the effect of creation and annihilation, but they don't talk about when does something created, when is annihilated. I've searched the books, and I'm very happy to be told. My hypothesis is determined by the operation of the classical apparatus acting downward in exactly the same way that contextual wave function collapse takes place. Creation and annihilation also takes place in a way determined by the higher level classical context. So the project has analyzed the function of different levels of structure in a light harvesting complex, and parallel to the way it's done for a photodiode in the contextual wave function collapse paper, where creation and annihilation operators do indeed play a role. confirm that the action of creation and annihilation operators is determined by a classical context. And here's a picture of a chloroplast stroma, and you see light coming in on the left, the yellow coming down, and you see electrons being released and going down. You get another light coming in. When it's absorbed, that's a creation, an annihilation operator. Electrons going down. And so I think what's happening here is creation and annihilation operators are acting, and where and when they act is shaped by the incoming light and by the molecular shapes, which are classical variables and are central to all molecular biology. So, by conclusion, what have we gained? Quantum mechanics holds everywhere, but only local wave functions exist. The criteria for local domains is not size nor energy, but linearity. The Copenhagen approach is valid. There's an effective classical apparatus. Molecular shape is classical, and that's the basis of molecular biology. And people like Karplus are showing how that is the case. And there may be others, but he's the one which I have become particularly aware of. What have we lost? We've lost Schrödinger's cat. That's not a great loss. We've lost the wave function of a brain and theories based on such, and there's a whole slew of people out there trying to say there's a wave function of the brain. Come on, what? The brain is incredibly nonlinear. A wave function behaves in a linear way. There's no possibility you can describe a brain by a single wave function. And therefore, inter alia, you may have heard of Boltzmann brains bobbing in and out of existence from the quantum faction. Pure fantasy. And you lose the wave function of the universe, and for those who are interested, you lose the Everest interpretation of quantum physics. Well, that's a pretty good thing.
George, for a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. We'll have lots to think about. Are there questions for George?
I find it quite difficult to hear, so you'll have to repeat the question.
Yes, are there questions for George? And I might have.
Yeah. Okay. So hi, George. Can you hear? Yeah. Hello. Yes. You mentioned for biology there is. I mean, you said for physics there is no function purpose, but for biology there is. But I wonder why. I think biology has also no purpose.
Well, you. If you examine biology, you'll see every single level of biology. And I gave you a quote from a Nobel Prize winner at the cellular level. The cellular level has incredibly complicated machinery. Each part of that machinery has a purpose to make proteins, to make energy, to move things around. They all have purpose. So, well, they will have, I'll use the word function. I'm not using the word agency. At a higher level, agency comes in. But it is a major distinction. The moon doesn't have a purpose, at least I don't think it does. An atom by itself doesn't have a purpose. But a heart has a purpose, it's there to pump blood. An eye has a purpose, it's to see. So each of them has a function, and a gene regulatory network has the purpose of determining what gene gets read, where, and when. There's purpose all over the place, or at least function.
Any other questions for George? Please.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I have a question about the lecture notes of the Nobel laureates. You mentioned that the classical physics is adequate. The classical physics on that slide is adequate to describe the molecular, at the molecular level, everything. But if I'm not mistaken, that Nobel Prize was given for the quantum mechanic, molecular mechanic to the Karplus. Am I right?
Quantum mechanics origin?
Can you, yeah,
Which slide was it?
Back. Yeah, the quote, yes.
The quote by who? Like Carplet. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way.
Yeah, here, I guess.
This one?
Cannot find it.
Like that?
Okay, let me just summarize it. The quote was that classical mechanic is enough, adequate to describe all the, but
This, actually underlying all of this is the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. And the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, you are separating, you're treating the nuclei classically and the electrons quantum mechanically. You've already made the separation, the Born-Oppenheimer approximation.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Please, Bethany.
Thanks so much for the very interesting talk. In defense of some of the quantum brain theories, they do exactly look at how, not at one wave function for the entire brain, but wave functions for, say, electron transfers that then scale up to changes in ion channels. And so in that way.
I'm fine with that. The trouble is, for instance, when Roger Penrose tried to say that consciousness is based at the level nucleus level. Sure, at the ion channel level it is, but nevertheless an ion channel, I don't believe can be described by a single wave function. I think it must need at least four wave functions.
I think, but the fact that a single electron transfer can change the conformation of a protein means that on that level it's quantum.
Absolutely.
So even though the entire molecule is messy and can't be described by a single wave function, the whole molecule depends, the conformation of the whole molecule depends on a single electron transfer that can be described.
Yeah, but how are you describing the shape of the molecule starting on a quantum mechanical term?
Because if you know that if you have an electron transfer, you're going to, so like retinal, the chromophore that goes from cis to I can't remember the other formation of retinal, it'll change the whole rhodopsin protein. It's just one describable by quantum mechanics, and you will know what the end result is.
But the end results are classical.
Yeah, I agree the end result's classical, but you can describe the end result.
What I would like you to think about is, are creation and annihilation operators involved in this?
Well, we can chat more about it. I'll think about it.
Thank you. Are there more questions for Professor Ellis? Here we go.
Yeah, I have a question. There's a whole field of study about nonlinear Schrödinger equations. They're nonlinear. So are they better used to describe nature, better suited than the linear theory, or not?
You can.
Nonlinear Schrödinger equations.
I don't know what it's used for. Yeah, and I'm saying I don't know what it's used for. Can you tell me what it's used for?
Oh, well, many people study nonlinear Schrödinger equations, right?
But then you don't have superposition, you don't have entanglement, you don't have the basic quantum mechanical features.
That is correct. I mean, I thought you were a proponent of nonlinearity, and within the realm of quantum theory, people study the nonlinear Schrödinger equation.
No, I'm not talking about that. No, I personally don't. You've lost all of the core features of quantum theory if you do that.
Could I butt in? The nonlinear Schrödinger equation is derived in water waves, not quantum. It has no quantum connection as far as I know. It's a water wave model.
It's right, what? Water. So it's a top-down effect from the context on the quantum physics.
It's just the name that's similar. The first term in the nonlinear Schrödinger equation is the linear part, and then the rest gets added on. It's mod u squared times u,
and then
it describes the elevation of a wave on deep water.
Yeah, and then you can't. So that's fine for describing water in terms of quantum physics. No Hilbert space, no superposition, no entanglement.
Any more questions? Okay, that doesn't seem to be the case. Then, George, let me thank you very much with offering you mathematics magazine
Well, thank you.
that NITheCS publishes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we need the obligatory photo shoot.